that would be really impressive if I didn't write it myself. So thank you very much, Miqdad. A real pleasure to be here today. Hold on, am I going? Oh, I go down. All right, perfect. Wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. I will today be talking about the topic of building communities in a divided Britain. I very much, like you, I'm sure, look up and down the country and think, what on earth is going on and how divided we seem to be. And I asked the really basic question, what can I do? And then I asked the question, what can we do? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to take something which is usually deeply complicated and embedded in lots of different nuances and try and come up with something that each and every one of us can today go away and think, okay, that's something that I can do to achieve. So a bit more about me. As Miqdad has said, I work at the Prince's Trust, where I am head of Mosaic, which I'll go on to explain in a bit later, and head of community integration. So I literally think about this every day. We work with a lot of young people, and I'm constantly thinking about how can we bring them together. And whilst there are lots of challenges with many different solutions, and I think they speak to the fluidity of people and the cultures that are part of their identities, I want to advocate the importance of something called a relatable role model, and the power of one role model, which I think is the reach of everybody in this room. So when I say divided Britain, I really want to ask. By the way, I'm very interactive. I ask questions, so if you think you're going to sit here and just watch me, it's not going to work. So what is the one thing that you, like at the moment, what is the one thing that is dividing Britain? I had someone whisper Brexit. It's almost like we've worked on this together. There we go. I also have lots of animations on my presentation. I just think they're fun sometimes. So absolutely. The thing that is obviously very current right now is Brexit. June 2016, we had a referendum, and the results showed a divided country. And lots of people have lots of different reasons as to why that division happened. But I want to go into a bit more detail to try and extrapolate, because I think it's a really good window into some of the nuances of what the divisions in our country are. And before we can help a divided Britain, we need to understand what divides Britain. So I wasn't expecting my image to be there. There we go. Wonderful stuff. So here's a map which highlights the vote that took place. And we've got some numbers on there. And the numbers are obviously very clear. It was a 52 to 48 with a 30 million people turnout, and you had some very interesting divisions. So on the whole, England voted for Brexit, so did Wales, and you had Scotland and Northern Ireland who voted to remain. Obviously, there are lots of London voted to remain, and you had some other very interesting voting patterns. But there are some very interesting analyses that I'd like to go into. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation talks about how poorer households with incomes of less than £20,000 per year were much more likely to support leaving the EU than the wealthier. So you have a juxtaposition versus low household income versus high, which I think is, most people will think that would make sense. And then interestingly, unemployed, people in low skills, and manual occupations were also higher likelihood to vote for Brexit. Groups vulnerable to poverty were more likely to support Brexit. Age, income, and education matter, although educational inequality became the biggest driver. All things being equal, there were a 30 percentage point difference between those with GCSE qualifications or below that voted for a Brexit. So what you attained in terms of your qualifications matters. And all of this, I'm building a picture here because, again, I want to ask the question to you guys at the end of it, what can we do to solve this? And many of us have the privilege of having these qualifications, of having these degrees, and I want us to think about what can we do to reach across not just the people that we know, but beyond, using the assets that we have as our privileges. So interestingly, support for Brexit varied not only between individuals, but also between areas. People with all qualifications were more likely to vote leave in low-skill areas. So despite me saying, if you have a higher qualification, you were not going to vote and you were going to vote Remain. If you're in an area, so if you're up north, for us in England, around Grimsby maybe, or in Hull, even if you have a higher qualification, you are going to vote Brexit. You're going to vote to leave the European Union. And it's interesting because actually when you look at the data, economic arguments were about 15% of the reasons why people in the end voted for it. The data is around sovereignty of the nation and immigration. So, interestingly, groups in Britain who have been left behind by rapid economic change and feel adrift from the mainstream were more likely to vote Brexit. I think that's fairly obvious. So I want to now go on to something else. This paints a very basic picture as to some of the nuances of the country that is currently divided. And there was an interesting report that I also read, which is by an anti-fascism and anti-racism charity called Hope Not Hate. And it was called Fear, Hope and Loss. And they do a regular survey looking at, and this is an organization that's been going for many years, and they look at the drivers for hate in the country. And they look at what causes people to potentially hate on others. So the people in this room, like me, why might members of our country think to hate on us? And it's a very, very interesting one. In the forward for this, the MP for Wigan, Lisa Nandy, talked about how essentially in our country, there are now two countries that sit unhappily side by side. And again, she says these divisions are way more than just the Brexit. She observes that over the last 40 years, towns have aged and cities have grown younger. Social attitudes on immigration, social security, and civil rights have diverged. And as we've mentioned, globalization seems to have benefited some over others. It's a long quote. I won't read the whole quote, but it's an interesting one. The author of that report, her name is Rosie Carter. And Rosie wrote a little commentary in the report where she talked about where some of her data came from. And it was from a national conversation that Hope Not Hate did with an organization called British Futures. And it was a conversation about immigration across the country. And interestingly, she says, even though the conversations were about immigration, actually, they talked about it in a way that intertwined with other frustrations. The distance from Westminster, the nature of work, cuts to public services, the decline of industry, boarded up high streets, future prospects for their kids. These are things that worry me and you. And I think that level of understanding of why people may have voted a particular way is really important for us to understand before we think how we might bring the country together. All right, so I just put that on there because I realize at this point you might be bored of some data. So I thought if I put that up there, you'd be entranced and you'd think, oh, he's like the Matrix and he's like Neo and he's going to give us some more data. So I am going to give you a bit more data because I really, really want to understand what it is that really divides. So in that report, the Fear, Hope and Loss, in July 2018, so this summer, 10,000 people, it was a poll of 10,000 people, and it found a significant difference between younger and older people, with younger people far more likely to see the benefits of multiculturalism and less concerned with immigration. And it's interesting, less likely to hold prejudiced views about Muslims and Islam in Britain in particular. Just 7% of younger people, 18 to 24, listed immigration in the top 3 most important things for them. This compared to 30% of people above 65. That's across the country. So just to put it into context, the very people in this room, me, proud Muslim, we are a concern to 30% of people over the age of 65. And only to 7% of people who are 18 to 24. So a really interesting age demographic there. 22% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that Islamist terrorism reflected a widespread hostility, compared to over a third of people who are over 65. 76% of that age bracket who are young felt that diversity is integral to our culture, whereas less than half of 65 plus. I'm not trying to paint a picture where old people are the problem, but I really trying to show that actually there's some really interesting divergent views of a Britain that people as Britain has moved on and immigration has come in and diversity set in, there's been some really interesting trends. And here's a fun one. I don't know what newspapers you read. I like to read a very wide diversity. I know Mick Dad is Mr. Newspaper Man. 74% of Guardian readers saw multiculturalism as having a positive effect on Britain and British culture, and 78% felt it had a positive effect. Only 45% of Express readers saw a positive effect on multiculturalism on the economy, and 31% saw a positive effect on British culture. So again, the divisions go right across age, we're talking sector, we're talking region, we're talking newspapers, and they intersect incredibly depending on the region, and some are more powerful than others. So it's not one simple thing that is causing a problem, and it's certainly not black and white. What is absolutely causing us to, we're unable to go beyond our problems at the moment, and part of it is our echo chamber. And so this is a really interesting diagram about the echo chamber effect. So there's some funny ones on the right, but essentially the problem being most people in London who voted in the EU referendum genuinely were surprised the morning after the result or the vote, thinking, how did this happen? And that's because if you're online, if you're on social media, you're likely to only be engaging with people that look like you, that talk like you, that essentially are an extension of you. And very few of us are doing, every one of us has it's a communal thing. As communal beings, we want to be with people who confirm our biases. It's easier, right? It's easy to live like that. We've got lots of things going on. We've got to pay the bills. We've got other issues. We've got family problem, whatever it might be. And it's easier for us to be people who are like us. And there's a confirmation bias associated with that, and it extends. Whether you're young, whether you're old, it's the same problem. And that confirmation bias only works to compound the divisions that are happening elsewhere. Because if people are feeling upset, there's no way for them to ameliorate that because they don't have access or contact with people who they are thinking are the problem. A really interesting fact that I saw was actually the people who cited immigration to be the biggest problem had the least immigration in their cities. So the people who actually don't have access to immigrants or people potentially of color are the ones who are most likely to see them as a threat, which I think is a really, really important point. So, I don't know does anyone know who's on that screen right now? It's probably a good thing. So Tomi Lahren, right there at the top, is a very controversial American right-wing commentator. And she's being interviewed by one of my favorite TV personalities. His name is Trevor Noah. He's a comedian from South Africa who went to America and runs and now is on The Daily Show. She is doing something here. She's trying to intellectualize. So she's part of the alt-right movement and absolutely has been advocating some of the more controversial things happening in America. And she, right now, this was a famous interview, and Trevor got castigated for doing it because everybody argued that A, he didn't challenge her enough, and B, gave a platform to somebody who was spewing hate. But what she's doing here, she's saying true diversity is diversity of thought, not diversity of color. I don't see color. So she's so enlightened that color doesn't come into her imagination. It's an intellectualization of what some would say are clearly racist views, and attempting to shift the conversation away from the real issue of integration in an increasingly diverse society. And it brings about quite an important point. Britain is increasingly more diverse for lots of reasons. Past colonial territories through to economic migration now, whatever it may be, universities, graduates, etc. So as it's becoming more diverse, are people from different walks of life mixing with one another? It's a really important question to be asking. So, the UK government founded a few years ago the Social Integration Commission to ask this very question. To ask the question, are we as a country looking at how we are socially integrating with each other? Now, what does that even mean? So the definition of diversity and social integration is from the Commission. So diversity, ways that people are different from each other. Although there are many ways that they can be diverse, I've put Social Mobility Commission, it's wrong. Fact check, McDad. It refers to diversity along social grade, ethnicity, and age, and social integration is where people in Britain interact with each other who are different to themselves. So in relation to age, social grade, and ethnicity, so I'm going to ask you guys the question. When it comes to age, social grade, and ethnicity, who here feels they are fairly well socially integrated? I'm going to put my hand up just because but for the sake of the camera, there's very few hands up, 0. But it's a really important point, right? I have the pleasure of working with government, and sometimes we get asked these questions: are your communities integrating? And I asked the same question back. I remember having a meeting with a fairly high-level official once, and I asked the question. I think this is really important that we're talking about social integration and communities that need it. When's the last time you went to happened to be Muslim? When's the last time you went to someone's home who was Muslim for dinner? Not for work, not to talk about integration, but genuinely just to engage and have fun and talk. And then I offered my home and said, please come round. I'd love to have you. And I got a politician's answer, which is a very good question. I'll go away and think about it. But I think we have to ask ourselves the same question. So that's what we are. So how socially integrated are we as a nation? That image says it all. So from the Commission, what is quite clear is the average Briton has fewer social integrations with people who are different to them, and we're talking social grade, ethnicity, and age, than they would have if there was no social segregation. So you're 14% less likely to be integrated by social grade, 48% by ethnicity, and 42% when it comes to age. So why is this important? Highly diverse areas. So London is actually a culprit. We think we're diverse. We are, but we're not integrated. Despite socializing with more people of different ethnic groups, Londoners are proportionately less integrated by social grade, ethnicity, and age than the rest of Britain. London is the least integrated place in the UK, and we pride ourselves on being integrated. And I think it's a really interesting thing when you think about it. Integration issues apply to everybody, not just ethnic minorities, and I think that's a really important conversation to be having. All ethnic groups are about 40 to 50% have fewer social interactions than would occur if there was no social integration. Another really important point actually is where there is contact happening is around places and institutions that are of value. So universities are a really good example, and actually higher education and education is where you end up really mixing and making your friends. And I know I can speak to that really well. I grew up in Tower Hamlets, where genuinely I went to a school which was 95% ethnically Bangladeshi like me. And then college was similar. It was only when I got to university where I started making friends like Mohammed Walji. I promised I would say his name. So he's in Istanbul and was very upset with me because he said he's not here. So people, I was able to make a really interesting, diverse group of friends. And that was only at higher education. But then there are other challenges of social mobility. Can you get to universities? Can you get to the right universities? Can you not? And so there seems to be interesting impediments as to how you engage through this particular issue. Young people, in particular, are segregated by ethnicity. So those who are under 17 years have 50% fewer interactions with other ethnicities than would have been expected if there was no social segregation. And finally, there is a disconnect between employers and those looking for work or seeking to progress in their careers. Why does this even matter? I always ask that question. Why is this? Why am I having this conversation with you? Why is this important? Why should social integration be a thing? And so I asked that question. Why does it matter? So, for one, and there are some important data points there, in the next 10 to 15 years, the UK's population who are under 18 or over 60 is projected to rise to just under half of the population. And that's really important. We're hearing things about mental health in young people because of all the access to issues like access to digital information, social media, and the like. And then older people are feeling lonely. And then within communities, so I mean that's a generic issue. And then you have an issue where you have migrant communities coming from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, East Africa, where there is a culture of looking after the elderly. Then you have issues where people are having to work jobs because they can't afford rents and homes, and then the elderly are getting elderly, and then what do? Do you put them into homes? Do you not put them into homes? Do you look after your parents? It's then having an issue on marriages. These are real issues affecting every cross-section of society. Why do I mention it like that? Because again, it's a very interesting point that connects us, and yet it's dividing us in equal measure. The proportion of British residents who are going to be from an ethnic minority community will rise to about just under 40% by 2050, which is a really, really interesting and important figure to note, because I think that will drive some interesting issues around D&I, diversity. Did I say D&I? Yeah, I was like, I thought I got it wrong there. So you have really interesting issues around diversity, inclusion, and how companies will make sure that they're representing the population. So just today you had a report out which showed that ethnic minorities in higher education are 27% paid, lower paid than their white counterparts. Those things are going to become important data points, and they're going to raise questions. And if we don't address a really important base point of working with each other and having contact with each other, these conversations will become harder and harder to have. And finally, and this is an obvious one, I think, the income gap between the richest and poorest members of society will widen. So I've mentioned those points, and now I've got my favorite Harvey Specter up on the screen from Suits. I know the gentlemen here all watch Suits religiously. No. It's a program about lawyers in America. Interestingly, it's where the Duchess of Sussex, previously known as Meghan Markle, made her name as an actress, if that helps. So what's my point? So what? These things are happening. What do we do? What will happen if we don't address social integration is going to make it harder to access the various social and economic challenges that modern Britain will face. So what are some of those? Long-term unemployment. Lack of contact with those in work makes unemployment and insecure employment last longer. We know that's the case. The government's integration strategy shows that. There are people who, as well as university, work is a really good place to meet people who don't look like you, think like you, come from the same backgrounds as you, or have the same religion as you potentially. And it's a really important thing to do. So long-term, if ethnic minorities are rising and they're not getting into work, there's an issue around unemployability. Blocked opportunities. A lack of broader networks makes it harder for employers to recruit the right talent. Social isolation. A lack of friendships across age and social grades increases isolation, particularly amongst elderly and vulnerable adults. Community well-being. Social segregation increases anxiety and ill health. More effective social integration leads to increased life expectancy, better recovery times from health issues, and fewer mental health issues. These are all things that are going to become really, really important. So it's not just because it's nice to know somebody who doesn't look like you. It's actually for the greater good of our economy and our society that we must do this. I'm going to now paint a doomsday picture of what happens if we don't. And it's interesting. They did simulations as to what happens if social integration doesn't work very well. So interestingly, you have schools become increasingly divided along ethnic and social lines, way more than now because of the catchment areas. Democracy risks being weakened as who we vote for and whether we vote at all is determined by our ethnicity, our age, and our social grade. So it becomes really block voting and tribal voting. So you end up voting for the person that looks like you as opposed to the person that's good for the country. And I think Brexit is an interesting window into what that could look like. And I think the wonderful thing about our country has been actually we've always been able to vote for people who are good for the greater good. And last, gated communities become the norm. You know, even in areas which at first sight appear mixed, Buildings will have one entrance for the affluent, another for those relying on state support. We're seeing that right now. There are examples of buildings being built which are part private, part public, and you have a recent example in East London where you had a gym that was only available to those who were paying private rent and not available to those who were paying social rent. So it's happening. It's just going to get worse if we don't try and fix this divide. So I'm going to go to the next slide. What needs to be done? So that is a very heavy page there, my apologies. And the reason for that is there are a few things which were mentioned that could be done. And I want to go through just a couple of them. One which is business and public sector should recognize the benefits of social mixing and look to recruit from diverse talent pools. So this is what every one of us could be doing, and this is really important. So this is just for us to go away and think about. You have people living in diverse areas who should be encouraged to get to know their neighbors. This is a very diverse area. And I'm sure you do. The question is, how many of you know your diverse neighbors? You know, today's been a really, really great day. I at work lit the candles for Hanukkah. And it was amazing. We have this wonderful cultural awareness network, and I'm trying to lead by example, you know, walking the talk. Here I am talking about it. I'm trying to really walk it. So we did this wonderful thing where we got all of the Jewish community at work together and lots of others who wanted to celebrate and did it. And it's interesting because, and you're learning it not because I have to, it's not work, I really want to. And it really helps. So those are things that we can do. We should draw on the experience of parenthood to build understanding. It's a really ignored thing. You know, you're a parent. I saw this wonderful clip by Mehdi Hassan today where he was on a Seth Meyers show in America last night, and he talked about, whilst he doesn't agree with George Bush Senior or Junior, what he does recognize is a son mourning for his father because he's a child. He's also a parent. That level of familiarity is something that we can all recognize, and we just have to go back to our base humanity, and I think we very often forget to do that. Businesses should support their employees to volunteer and connect with the communities in which they work. So for those of you who are in business or have a business or have connections to businesses, I think that's what we should be promoting. And then the role of charities, which is obviously something I'm very, very involved with. Now, where do relatable role models come into this? So we talked about relatability. And for me, relatability is such a fluid concept. Relatability could mean anything and everything. I'm going to give you some case studies of the organization I oversee, Mosaic, at the Prince's Trust, and talk through how we've engaged relatability. But here, I just want to show you some research. So we work with young people. So I'm going to focus on young people for a second. To prevent young people from disengaging, to instill a belief that they can succeed, and to enable them to claim their stake in our economy and our society, they need to be confident that they are valued. It's really, really simple. Because segregation happens for two lots of reasons. One, which is the individual, and two, which is the wider self and the wider community. So if I'm segregated because you don't want to talk to me, there's not a lot I can do. When it's a combination of you don't want to talk to me and I can't talk for myself, then it becomes increasingly difficult. And one of the things that we try and work with is to help young people have the confidence to really think and go that they can go and talk to others. We commissioned some research at the start of this year to understand better what we can do for young people to claim their stake in our society and in the future economy. And one of the things that they said is they need more people that they can relate to. It's such a fluid term. What does relatability mean? It could be background, it could be circumstance, it could be heritage. It's interesting, people immediately go to faith or ethnicity. Not at all. I'll give you an example. I was in Bradford recently talking to the council there around their integration strategy, and they had these brilliant apprentices who had just started that day. It was their first day, and they came into the meeting. They were 17, they were white British, and they grew up in one of the most deprived council estates in Bradford. I went there with my suit, my shirt, my tie, thinking I was going to meet someone very senior, who I did, and they came to the meeting. And what was really interesting was I could tell they saw me and they were like, no, not a fan. You're from London. I'm from London. I have a London accent. They're from Bradford. So immediately like, no, not a fan. Then I was just like, all right, well, let me tell you about who I am. And so immediately there's a block. And it got even worse because I asked the question, what's the division like in Bradford? And they were really open about it. And they said, actually, there is division between us and the Asians. We don't really mix. We do our thing, they do their thing. There was no enmity. There was no necessary reason why it was evil. It was just we do this and they do that. And I just saw that as a really interesting challenge. I said, are you going to apply to university? And they said, no, we're not, because our BD postcode won't allow us to go to university. It won't work. I have a background in higher education and social mobility, as Miqdad read out. And I said to them, completely untrue. And then I told them, actually, I grew up in a council estate in East London, and I felt exactly the same way you did when I was growing up. And I could see their eyes light up a little bit, being like, oh, he's not what I thought he was. And then I went into it, and I talked to them about my own experiences. And actually, very soon, we were allied together against, not against per se, but we were allied together. And there was a level of connection there that did not exist at the beginning. And it was because of our experiential learning. And that relatability was, we had region going against us, we had ethnicity going against us, we had lots going against us, but what connected us is an aspiration to go to university and growing up in a similar circumstance. That's just one example of relatability. So relatability can cut through, and the reason why I went through all that data at the beginning was to demonstrate just how intersectional and how complicated the issues are that seem to be dividing our country at the moment. And actually, at every single one of those points, everyone in this room can say, I relate. I have something that I can connect with you on. And it's fascinating. I'm not a parent, but I have a niece and a nephew. I was with someone recently, and I just asked them a question around, how do you instill values in your child? This person and I have nothing in common, but that was instantly something that I asked the question. They're like, oh, yeah, there's a connection there. I'm really interested in this topic, and we started talking about it. So even then, there wasn't a direct connection. So I'm almost trying to make the point that actually there's a lot we can do to connect in that manner. And then we have this video, which I'm not going to show today, but it's available on our Mosaic network.co.uk website and on our YouTube page, which is about relatable role models. And Baroness Wasi gave a lovely quote, which is, a relatable role model is someone who is really authentic about who they are, where they come from, very honest about their backstory, and able to say to young people that it may seem like my world and your world is far removed, but the chances are we started off in the same place. And if I can do it, and yes, there are challenges on the way, if you're prepared to work hard, then you can do it too. And I think it's really, 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 really important. And it's something so simple that every one of us can do. So I'm going to quickly go on to the next slide. I have no idea of timing, by the way, so I'm not even looking at my time. I'm just going to keep talking until you tell me to stop. Working for the Prince's Trust. So Mosaic is part of the Prince's Trust. The Prince's Trust was founded 42 years ago by His Royal Highness Prince of Wales with his severance package from the Navy to help young people get into employment, essentially. Initially, it was very much around enterprise, but we have some wonderful role models. And I'm saying relatability is extendable. Not expendable, that would be the wrong word, extendable. And up there we have, hopefully the future James Bond, Idris Elba, who is an ambassador of the Prince's Trust. Now, this guy appeals to so many people. He's a DJ. So the reason why he is an ambassador is because he took a loan from the Prince's Trust as part of our enterprise scheme and paid for his acting school. And then that started his journey. In the same way, Muse got their first amp through the Prince's Trust. Fascinating stories. But he's a hugely relatable person that extends beyond. And just a really good example of somebody who I think demonstrates that actually that even if we don't see ourselves, I think what's easy here is I'm trying to get through to everyone in this room in a way which is there is no one notion of relatability. You have something that somebody else can take from. And I really hope that in some way, shape or form, I'm able to question your mind and you might consider thinking, okay, I should reach out to somebody who I would never usually do. Dynamo grew up in Bradford. Who did you guys know that he's also half Pakistani? He's half Pathan, which I think because of his family history he doesn't really talk about, but it's fascinating because actually he grew up in a really white working class area. But the relatability is fascinating because it's from Bradford. He's obviously got a mixed heritage, and a lot of people see him in different ways. And the reason why I've got him up again, he paid for his first magic box with the Princess Trust loan, which again is really, really interesting. Just the caliber of people who did that. So Mosaic, we founded by the Prince of Wales 11 years ago, with a focus on young Muslims in particular. And actually, one of the reasons was actually, the quote is a wonderful one: unlocking the talent and realizing the full potential of every young person, whatever the background or circumstance, of course, close to my heart. And at the heart of it is a connectivity, because the question was, and I think there was a focus on young Muslims from deprived areas, and the question was, why is there a disconnect between people who are doing really well and people who aren't, and we need to connect them together. And so that's what Mosaic was founded to do. So I'm now going to do something a bit more engaging, because I want to almost articulate relatability with you. So we're going to play a game called Top Trumps, and I'm going to give you some data, and it's a really easy one. So how much of the UK Muslim population live in 10% of the most deprived local authority districts? I put in 31%. Is it higher or lower? Higher or lower? Okay. Okay, we have one lower and a few higher. Higher. It's 46%. Within the economically active population, what percent of the Muslim population is in full-time employment? 11%, higher or lower? Higher. We're getting higher. Higher. 19.8%. Compared, which is compared, it's important, to more than 1 in 3, 35% of the overall population. What percent of Muslim women are economically active? 55%. Higher or lower? Oh, it's mixed. I'm going to go to the women here. Higher or lower? Higher. I'm getting higher from them. 65%. What percent of the Muslim population is in higher, so those who are working, higher managerial, administrative, and professional occupations? So this is middle management and above. 6% is pretty low. Higher or lower? Sorry, it's the same. So only 6% of those who are working are in middle management or above, which is an atrocious statistic. I know. Sorry. All right, finally, what is the percentage of Muslims in UK youth offender institutions? Bearing in mind we're 4.8% of the UK population based on the last census, 15% higher or lower? 22%. We're about 400% overrepresented in youth offender institutions. It's a really terrible statistic. So Mosaic, just briefly to share with you, bringing it all together. The primary aim of Mosaic and the mentoring programs that exist are to help young people fulfill their potential, focusing on 3 things: confidence, self-efficacy, and employability. Because we believe you get those 3 things right really early on in terms of soft outcomes, what you do is help them build that resilience that will enable them to feel a better sense of belonging, which is really important, and will give them the confidence to go off and do really well, which will then allow them to go into schools, employment, education, and all that kind of good stuff. I probably, because of time, won't go into too much detail, but a couple of case studies which I love. Mohammed here moved to London from Iraq. Very, very tough upbringing, and I'm just going to read it here. Most of his friends went down a difficult path of crime and illegal activity. He came to us, and amazingly, and this is what I love, his mentor is one of our now board members. On the face of it, they have nothing in common. His mentor, who won't mind me mentioning it, he's mentioned there, Uzair, is a brilliant businessman. He's an entrepreneur who's doing really well for himself. And they managed to connect over I think the love of entrepreneurship. Muhammad basically wasn't very good at systems and being organized and going down the traditional route. He played games at home all day, which sounds ridiculous, but he actually is very good and he makes money from playing games at home. He creates videos and there's a whole world out there of doing really well. Uzair understood that. Uzair understood that I understand not going down the conventional route because Uzair didn't go down the conventional route. And that was their relatability, and they worked together. And you have this brilliant group of students. In 2015, they won our Enterprise Challenge competition. Just a really brilliant mix. They're from Skinner's Academy in Hackney. It's a national competition. They beat about 4,000 other students from across the country to take part in a competition where they had to come up with a socially responsible idea. And their idea was, for those of you who are parents, Parent Pay has a card and you've got to pay your lunch money and fees on this card. And they said, well, where does the money go? And there's like, if this is £1.50 and I pay £1.35, where's that 15p go? Can you round it up and give it to charity? And that was their idea. And they managed to convince the CEO of Parent Pay to take on the idea and pilot it. And they piloted it. And the first time of piloting it, they raised close to £50,000 for charity. But what's remarkable is the story that they went on. They are friends now, but they weren't friends when they started in the program. They come from a very mixed background, the students. You have two twins. You have somebody who's ethnically Turkish, ethnically Polish, and they all got together through the love of Enterprise Challenge. And 3-4 years later, I still see them because we try and roll them out to programs, and they're still the best of friends. And that's because they had meaningful engagement at a really young age on something that was the Enterprise Challenge. So I will stop there. I hope I've articulated just the difficulties that we in the country have, which are deeply complex and layered, and then just what we can do individually, and given you an example of what we've been trying to do at one level through schools and programs and mentoring and young people to try and connect that relatability elements down. Thank you very much for your time.
It's a lot. So we have time for questions. Is there any questions from either side?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. I had 2 questions, if that's okay. So my first question is around the statistics that you presented around Brexit, and specifically in relation to kind of lower academic achievement or access to higher education, and household income. Obviously, these are potentially factors in terms of how people voted, but how, I guess, do we use these statistics without kind of falling into a trap where we feed a kind of perception of the types of people that voted for Brexit, if that makes sense, and that type of fear that they probably have in terms of how we see them. Do you get what I'm saying?
Totally, which is why I think I tried to balance that by saying there was a particular example where even if you're in an area with low employment, even if you have higher skills and higher degrees, you are likely to vote for Brexit. It's just one factor, but it's a factor, and the statistics show that actually it did make an impact. I'm entirely with you. I think we have to be very careful not to create reductionist viewpoints of people and how things work. And if you take a very singular viewpoint, it's easy to make those assumptions about people, I think, and we don't want to do that. I think they are driven by very complex issues. And I'm not for one assuming I know what those are individually, but thankfully there are people who've done the research and done it in quite a nuanced way. So I think we all have to be careful. And I mean, I've tried to paint a picture where it's not simply people who don't have a degree voted Brexit. It's not true at all. But people who don't have a degree also don't, and the data shows this, probably won't have access to the best jobs. and then are likely to be in areas where there's, industrialization hasn't happened, and they're in post-industrial towns, and therefore there is probably, and so it's all complicated and it's all interwoven. So I completely agree with you. I think it's important not to make lazy assumptions.
Yeah, so I guess obviously there is a story and there's a narrative, and then there's how all of these factors link together, and how there's a kind of this bigger picture. But I think the way that people talk about it, especially people on the Remain side, tend to kind of do it in this kind of reductionist way, which is which can be very demonizing of people that did vote Leave. And so I guess what my question is that obviously they use the statistics to then portray this kind of picture of the other, and I think that's part of this kind of divide that we're creating, right? The statistics are then being used to almost feed into the fear that I think people that voted for Brexit have of how people perceive them. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we can do it better.
No, I take the point. The very conversation about division might create division, and it's a really difficult one, because I think even the statistics I raised today, integration on the whole as an agenda, as a point, is taken probably by entities that are likely to be on one side of the fence, and so the data probably will be skewed in that way, and the think tanks or policy groups who probably are on the side of a Brexit probably won't be looking at integration in the way I was looking at integration. And so I think there are some, you've really hit a raw point there, which I take, and I probably don't have a very good answer right now, but I really take your point, because I think it's a really important one.
Thank you. And my second question, if it's okay,
Yeah, sure.
is about integration. And so you were talking about, how integrated and not integrated, particular parts of the UK or particular demographics are. What level of kind of connectivity or integration, for a better word, makes something integrated? So what is a kind of measure, if that makes sense?
So I think it's meaningful contact, I think, is the loose phrase, and I think it really, and this is a very low base. I think there is no high base, and this whole, it's a very soft science. The government, in terms of integration, is still looking at proxy measures. So it's how are we having meaningful contact with people that then, and there are there are matrices out there which measure this, which are deeply complex. So there are scorecards with 13 measures of how we do integration. There's no one particular factor, because that would speak badly to people. So there's I've seen matrices with 13, I've seen matrices with 30 measures. So it might be what's your view on multiculturalism, for example, some of the statistics I use. So those are all measures of how integration works. So I don't think it's just, did you have dinner with somebody? It's more around, having had contact, what's your viewpoint on particular issues? And in itself, that might be arguably questionable, because you could have contact and decide actually you don't like them. So, and I think there is a broader view, which I probably fall into, which I do think integration is about being open-minded, and I do believe actually, and the data shows this, if you have meaningful contact with people from different backgrounds, with an open mind and open heart, you will see them in a different light. I think that stands pretty much on any issue, and it doesn't have to be ethnicity, it doesn't have to be religion, it could be a whole litany of characteristics, actually, whether disability is one. You may have particular viewpoints, it could be, whatever it might be. And so I think it's a really, it's not a hard science at all, and it's being refined constantly. But there's a whole area of work around intercultural contact theory. So it's about, and it's interesting, they're looking at how even diasporic links might shape intercultural contact. So it doesn't have to be somebody from abroad, it could simply be somebody who has links through their heritage to another country, and does that count? So it's the problem with social sciences is I can get away with without giving you an answer.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. I mean, something has been puzzling me for a few decades now, not See, well, even at university, well, it's right to say that you are probably more likely to talk to other people who are not from your own ethnic or religious group than otherwise. But even there, we found that we were more close to non-English students. Whether they were Muslims or not was a different question, but still, from everywhere else. So is there something with the English people which makes them insular in a way, right, than others? Or if you go to different countries, you find that you could probably go and have dinner with somebody quite quickly. Here, it might take you a few years before you reach that step. So I mean, I'm not blaming, but is there something in the makeup of the English culture which
So, I mean,
stops them?
it's a really, really good question. I think it's, I don't know if you, I spend a lot of time up north for work, and they're some of the friendliest people I've met in my entire life. Where actually, you know, so I'll give you an example. I was in the Isle of Skye last year, and they had no idea who I was, but everybody was very welcoming. They opened up their mind. Maybe that's because they're Scottish. Maybe it doesn't apply. But my point, I don't think it's endemic to an entire English race, if you will. But I think university is an interesting point. I'm going to make assumptions. You're obviously very young, and so university, because for me what's really, really interesting about university and our communal behavior is no matter where we go, we want to be close to people who understand us, and I think that's absolutely fair. The difference is when it's the majority-minority dichotomy that is always a problem. And I do think actually universities sometimes aren't the best places because you end up being surrounded by the people that you're surrounded by. What you should be doing, and I think this is where, you know, generations, it does differ during generations. Now, if I go to some campuses, and I'm a trustee of a university, I think the world is a very different place, even from when I went to university 10, 15 years ago. Because actually, if I think back on to the friends I had, it's interesting actually. They weren't very white. There weren't that many white English friends I made at university. They were people who were diverse, but they weren't my diversity, but they were diverse. And I think it speaks to experiences maybe. And so I do think there is a problem. And I think one of the questions that I think that hasn't really been tackled in a lot of our integration literature is around the phrase commonly known as white flight. I know my family moved to an area in Essex where when we moved there, we were a minority in terms of like ethnic minority community. Within 5 to 10 years, all the English families had moved out. They moved out because, and it was interesting, they moved out because I think we moved in potentially. We're not sure. But that happens in a lot of places. So I think there is actually a question there to be answered. And I think there is joint responsibility around needing to be integrated. I think it works both ways, and I think you're spot on. I don't think, in the same way, I'm sure there are people who are up and down the country who are like, ethnically Bangladeshis don't like to engage with people who are white English. And I think there is a responsibility on the part of both parties to be open-minded to try and engage with each other, whether that's through their neighborhood, through their schools, or whatever it might be. So whilst I don't think it's endemic to an entire population, I can see why it might be a problem.
I teach in Wales as well sometimes. And although they seem to have voted leave, their attitude to other people is different from, well, definitely South England, yes. North Manchester, other places also. Wales is much better. Scotland is better. So there's something which is puzzling.
So it's funny. So it's interesting. So there's some research out there that shows Celtic nations generally. So if I look at it through the lens of a Muslim identity. It's funny, if I was to ask you guys, do you consider yourself British or English? What would you say? British on the whole. If you go to Wales and Scotland, they're Welsh and they're Scottish. They're not British. And I think there's something there that probably needs unpicking. And I do think you're right. I do think you're right. I think there's a tension there that has been there for a long time. And you know, I don't know if you saw recently, there was a announcement in France by the National Museums Authority, I think, or equivalent, where they were essentially urged to repatriate some goods back to Africa. And I know there's been a similar conversation here, and I think what we probably lack is a clear narrative on our relationship from a colonial period, actually. And I think it's related. I do think it's related. I think there's a national psyche that means, from the perspective of those, especially who are from a colonial history and a legacy, there is an absence of that narrative, potentially, that I think might also play a role. But when it comes to the Wales, Scotland, England divide, I feel it. I can't tell you why. Maybe we can work on it together, actually, because it'd be a very interesting study, because I do think you're right. Yeah. I mean, I'm there next week, so I'll let you know.
Any final question before we close?
The culture Anglo-Saxons, you know, they say the original British have been pushed to Wales and Scotland. I don't know if you go back. No, that's true actually, and most of England is Anglo-Saxon, so I don't know if there's some link to that as well.
Potentially.
Any final question?
Just a question of integration in itself. So why is it when we talk about integration, we talk about communities of immigrants, perhaps, but integration is a social thing. So even if you look at the class system, it's there. So from day one, wherever you go, whichever country you go to, you have that. So why are we focusing so much of integration in terms of communities rather than looking at it being a social thing? If you
Community versus social? Do you want to just unpick
so
that for me?
there's no integration between the lower class and the middle class within UK or any other country. Yeah, so it's the same kind of problems. So the root cause is social mobility, really.
By the way,
Yeah. So therefore, whenever integration is talked about, it's talked about in terms of immigrants and the local people not integrating. So I think the issue is more complex than that in terms of integration.
I agree. So I think some of the things I would have mentioned would have tried to unpick. Class is a thing I haven't mentioned, and I do think an invisible. It's invisible because we don't talk about it. But I think a really important issue that does. So I think what you have here is you have recent immigrants who've come in, who are then broadly based in the lower socioeconomic areas, and therefore the conversation becomes about integration. Whereas the reality is, if they can't get through to the top in terms of social mobility, then actually you will always be talking about integration. And so it's a real issue. I think you're right. And I think social mobility is at the heart of addressing integration, which is why I focus on employment, education, self-efficacy, confidence in young people, because you help them do that. You give them a sense of resilience to belong and to move up at the same time as addressing integration. Half the time I do think we are being reactive to narratives. Even if I look at the integration strategies that came out in the UK, which was, the Green Paper came out this year. The Green Paper came on the back of Louise Case's report into integration. Louise Case's report into integration was commissioned by David Cameron on the back of Islamist extremism. So I agree with you, and I think half the time, and yeah, so I mean, this is where you have politics playing politics, and those of us who are trying to work in this space are trying to keep that in mind whilst trying to do good. And it's being a pragmatic realist, essentially, where I talk about integration because integration is a language that everybody knows at the moment. But I think you're spot on. I think social integration, which is why the Social Integration Commission and a lot of the language I use was social integration, talks about things beyond immigrants. It talks about jobs, it talks about geography, it talks about age, location, and it tries to go beyond and community there actually differs, right? So actually a lot of the statistics I showed were beyond the immigrant narrative and that reductionist narrative.
When you're trying to take people out from social, lower social class, I really don't think that there is a need to do that. Rather, you need to work on the lower social people to try and. So, what I'm trying to say is that you always are going to have that divide, yeah. But how do you overcome any? So, there shouldn't be a need for or pressure on them to bring them up to a higher.
They shouldn't be penalized for where they are in society.
No, I'm not talking about. But you say like because those who are educated, they see those people at a disadvantaged people, but they themselves may not necessarily feel that. Why are we trying to impose for them to actually move to a higher social level?
Well, for me, it's not. They don't have to. They should have the opportunity to do so if they should want. I believe in opportunity. So, in no way are we. I mean, the numbers don't lie. In terms, if I just look at the Muslim community, 46 to 48% of that community live in the 5% most deprived areas of the UK. That isn't a natural number. That is not a natural number. That is not a number that should be the case if everything was equal. So when we talk about integration, integration isn't just about integration for them to integrate with other communities. Integration is being treated equally. And every member of so as a society, everybody is treated equally. So integration for me means individuals in that community should have the opportunity to go through society. We should be in a position where they aren't all in one lower socioeconomic bracket. And if they were, that's also okay. And I'm not saying in any way it's not a pejorative lens through which to look at them to say we're judgmental of you because you're in that bracket. I come from that bracket.
But I want to lift you up to my level. Right.
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, I mean that. So I think everybody. I mean, essentially, growing up, you were to say to me, "You should be happy with where you are." I wasn't happy with where I was. I wanted to move up actually, and I wanted to have the opportunity to move up. And I felt there were things were lacking and blocking me. So then you're telling me I'm not integrating, I'm coming back to you and saying, I've done everything you told me to do. I've done everything you've told me to do. Because actually, when you look at the numbers now, 15, 20 years ago, those schools weren't doing very well. Now they have some of the best grades in terms of inner city performance in the country. So they're getting the grades. Now what's happening is they've gamed the system in that they're doing well. As they traverse through life now, they're finding other blocks. And those blocks are usually the currency of professional life, the currency of navigating through social and cultural capital we're talking about, the things that you don't have access to. So whilst somebody else is imposing the language of integration and saying, you aren't integrating, it's a bit like the analogy I used earlier. I go back and ask them, are you integrating back to society? And actually, it's a complex conversation. And I do think that if I take the broader point that you're raising, I wouldn't want anyone to think I was suggesting in any way that people should go from one place to the other. It's simply saying everyone should have the opportunity to be mobile in our society. And I don't think that's the case at the moment. I think there are barriers that prevent people from socially being mobile, and that social mobility is then preventing their social integration. And the two are inextricably linked. McDad's disappeared.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there. Muhammad wa Muhammad salawat. Inshallah, Nizam will still be around for any further questions if you want to have a discussion.